always known as Easter in its original Hebrew, hides a meaning far darker and more powerful than the church ever taught you.
Pesach does not mean Passover, as you've been told. The real translation will shatter everything you believe about God's protection.
Get ready to discover what the translators have hidden from you for thousands of years. The time of judgment is upon us.
The metallic scent of blood, still warm, clings to the heavy, suffocating air that wraps around every house in that Egyptian hell. A man crushed beneath an impossible burden lifts the hyssop branch for the last and fateful time. His hands, calloused by a lifetime in the wilderness, now tremble, not from any trivial fear, but under the colossal weight of what is about to unfold. A story that, in minutes, will seal the destiny of millions. On the doorposts and lintels of every Hebrew home, the crimson mark, still wet and alive, drips slowly down rough, splintered wood, a silent omen bleeding into eternity. Outside, the night wind of the desert, cold and merciless as a spectre, carries with it distant whispers of primal anguish, a lament that will soon erupt into a universal cry of despair. The lamb that only moments ago was bleating softly, an echo of innocent life, now lies silent and still on the stone table, its warm blood running deep red and viscous through the calloused fingers of a father who, in the depths of his soul, grasps only fragments of the cosmic mystery he is participating in. The children, wide-eyed and wordless, watch the scene in petrified silence, their young faces catching the trembling light of oil lamps while their mothers prepare the bitter herbs with an urgency that goes far beyond mere obedience, an urgency that speaks of survival and faith. Here, at the epicenter of an imminent redemption, a single Hebrew word is about to be catastrophically and profoundly misunderstood for millennia. You, like most people, have always heard the story that Pesach means to pass over, as if God himself were a cautious angel of death, a divine spectre who somehow skillfully avoided the marked houses, carefully steering around them with calculated prudence. But the original Hebrew, in its rawness and power, reveals a far deeper truth, a reality that is viscerally more unsettling and more transforming. Pesach is not about passive evasion. It is not about a calculated detour. It is about active protection, fierce defense, violent and passionate intervention. It is about a God who does not merely pass by, but who plants himself firmly in front of the door, a divine sentinel who confronts and fights. This mistranslation, this subtle distortion of meaning, did not merely reshape our theology. It completely redefined our understanding of how the absolute protects us. When you encounter the true meaning of Pesach, your faith, your foundations, your very perception of the divine will never be the same. Prepare yourself to see Passover not as a distant ritual, but through completely new eyes, with a mind recalibrated for truth. The trilateral Hebrew root ps shech, Pesach, engraved in the depths of the Semitic tongue, reveals layers of meaning, depths of intention that traditional translations, in their simplicity, simply ignored, or, in a darker reading, deliberately concealed. The original Hebrew declares that Pesach derives from a root meaning to protect by covering, or, even more powerfully, to defend by standing over. The verbal form does not point to a movement of gentle or evasive passing. It describes the intense and unwavering action of a protector who heroically positions himself over what he defends. Like a majestic bird spreading its powerful and sheltering wings over its vulnerable young. A living shield against danger. It is militant protection, not passive, a defense that imposes itself, not one that steps aside. When we search through the other occurrences of this root across the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, we find consistent and undeniable confirmation. In Isaiah 31:5, the same verb, charged with force and intention, describes how Yahweh will protect Jerusalem as birds protect their nests, not by flying around in hesitant circles, but by remaining firmly over them, covering them with outstretched wings, a living, impenetrable barrier. In 1 Kings 18:21, at the dramatic scene on Mount Carmel, when Elijah, the prophet of fire, asks, "How long will you waver between two opinions?" he uses the same root, suggesting a hesitant, swaying movement, a leaning from side to side, but never a complete abandonment or an indifferent passing through. The essence is always one of presence, of covering, of interposition. The archaeological context of the Exodus, dated by conservative scholars between 1446 and 1440 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III, reveals an Egyptian civilization at the pinnacle of its military, economic, and religious power. Egyptian funerary practices of the era were not mere rituals. They were complex systems of protection for the dead, intricate rites designed to guarantee safe passage into the afterlife. The 10th plague, therefore, is not an isolated event. It represents a direct confrontation, a cosmic battle between Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the Egyptian gods of death and protection, particularly Anubis, the jackal-headed deity, guardian of the dead, and Osiris, lord of the underworld. The blood on the doorframes of the Hebrew homes was not a mere signal for God to step around them. It was a powerful symbol, a covenant of protection, where Yahweh would literally take his position as an armed guardian, a divine sentinel at the entrance of every house marked with the blood of the Lamb. Contemporary Egyptian reliefs confirm this truth, depicting protective deities positioned not in transit, but fixed, imposing at the entrances of palaces and temples, not to pass through, but to remain as eternal sentinels, vigilant and immovable. Here lies the seismic revelation that will indelibly transform your deepest understanding. When the sacred text declares that Yahweh will do Pesach over the houses of Israel, he is not avoiding those homes with a cautious detour. He is positioning himself in all his glory and power as a divine warrior, an invincible shield, on the threshold of every door marked with the blood of the Lamb. The original Hebrew unveils that God is not a death angel moving with caution, but a fierce protector who directly confronts the forces of destruction, who stands face to face against annihilation. Picture the scene in vivid, terrifying detail as the Makshit, the destroyer, the personification of the plague, sweeps with pitiless fury across all of Egypt, executing divine judgment over every unmarked home. Yahweh, the Lord of armies, literally plants himself immovable and towering in front of every Israelite house, his cosmic wings extended in militant protection, a living barrier of incalculable power. There is no gentle passing here, no courteous detour. There is a direct, titanic confrontation between the overwhelming protective power of God and the brutal forces of death attempting to break through. This visceral understanding of Pesach connects prophetically and undeniably to the breathtaking words of Isaiah 53, where the Messiah courageously positions himself between sinful humanity and the divine wrath we deserve, not passing over sin as if it doesn't exist, but actively absorbing into his own flesh and spirit the killing blow that was meant for us. Biblical typology reveals Jesus as the true Passover lamb, who does not merely die in sacrifice, but whose redeeming blood marks our spiritual doorways, our souls, causing the Father, in his justice and love, to position himself as our eternal and unshakable defender. The honor and shame system of the ancient Near East confirms this foundational truth. A protector who simply passes over those in his care would have been considered a coward, negligent, unworthy, but a protector who stands firm and fights with all his strength for the honor and the lives of those under his care, that is a God worthy of unconditional worship, of absolute trust, of faith that moves mountains. The chiastic structure of Exodus 12, carefully crafted, places the act of Pesach at the absolute center of the narrative. not as an act of evasion, but as the climactic moment where God demonstrates, unforgettably, his definitive protective nature, his sovereign intervention, every detail, from the blood on the doorframes to the posture of readiness among the Israelites, sandals on, staffs in hand, ready to move, points to a God who does not flee confrontation, who does not dodge danger, but who deliberately places himself in the path of destruction to protect his own, to interpose, to fight. When you understand in its essence that Pesach means active, fierce, and unshakable protection, rather than a passive, evasive passing, the entire theology of salvation is transformed. We are not saved because God ignores our sin or steers around it, but because he, actively and sacrificially, interposes himself between us and the consequences we deserve, absorbing them into himself. The blood of the lamb on the doorframes was not merely a sign, not merely a reminder. It was a neurological gateway, a primordial activator connecting your brain, your nervous system, to that same frequency of divine protection, to that same resonance of security that on that fateful night delivered the Israelites from death. When you finally grasp that Pesach, P-S-Ch, means to protect with outstretched wings, something extraordinary, almost mystical, happens within your central nervous system, a deep recalibration of your perception of safety. Modern neuroscience, in its most recent discoveries, has revealed that the sensation of active protection triggers the vagus nerve, the great communicator between the brain and body, dramatically lowering cortisol levels, the stress hormone, while increasing the production of oxytocin, the hormone of bonding and trust. But in truth, something far deeper and more ancient is happening here, a layer of meaning that transcends mere biology. Close your eyes for a moment. Visualize this scene with all your senses. You are in your home. The silence of the Egyptian midnight is broken only by the mournful wind, and suddenly you feel a protective presence, towering and unshakable, hovering over your home, covering it with an invisible force. It is no linguistic or cultural coincidence that the Hebrew term for this active protection is identical to the powerful and encompassing movement of an eagle's wings over its vulnerable young. Your brain, with its ancient layered complexity, possesses specific receptors, biological antennae, programmed for this primordial sensation of divine covering, of a supernatural shield. When the Israelites applied the blood to their doorposts, and in their hearts truly understood the visceral meaning of Pesach, they were not merely following a ritual. They were experiencing what neuroscientists today, in their modern language, call the parasympathetic safety response, a state of profound calm and protection. Here is what truly happens within you when you understand this in its essence. Your amygdala, the center of fear and anxiety in your brain, receives unambiguous signals that there is supernatural protection, divine guardianship over you. The hypothalamus, the conductor of your emotions, releases a cascade of endorphins and well-being neurotransmitters. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for faith, decision-making, and hope, activates intensely, as if receiving an injection of certainty. It is as if God himself intrinsically programmed your nervous system to recognize his active protection, his comprehensive care. And this is no mere metaphor, it is sacred biology, a truth written into your own constitution. But here is something that, if applied, will completely transform the way you pray, the way you live, and the way you experience this protection. Every time you speak the word Pesach with the correct understanding, divine protection with outstretched wings, an imposing shield, you are activating the very same neural pathways, the same cerebral networks that allowed the Israelites to remain calm, confident, and unshaken while devastating judgment swept through Egypt all around them. Try it now, in this exact moment. Breathe deeply, feel the air in your lungs, and say aloud or in your heart, Lord, you are my Pesach. and feel the profound, palpable difference in your body, your mind, your spirit. Archaeological evidence confirms that ancient Hebrews had specific protective rituals involving arm gestures, physical movements, that mimicked the breadth and power of sheltering wings. They knew intuitively that body and mind needed to be aligned in perfect synchrony with spiritual truth for it to manifest fully. When Jesus, the Messiah, spoke those moving words, "How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings," he was using with precise and intentional force exactly this ancestral, visceral understanding of Pesach. Your limbic system, the seat of your deepest emotions and memories, was designed to respond innately to this language of protection, of covering, of safety. Now, every time you face an imminent threat, whether financial, emotional, physical, or spiritual, instead of merely offering a generic prayer for protection, declare with authority and faith, "You are my Pesach, Lord. Your wings are over me." Watch how your heartbeat, previously racing, normalizes. How your thoughts, previously scattered, organize. How a supernatural peace, inexplicable by reason, takes hold of your entire being. This is not mere self-suggestion, not a trick of the mind. It is the deep and powerful activation of biblical truth within your neurological system. A harmonization with divine frequency. The difference between someone who lives with this transforming understanding and someone who merely passed over the revelation without absorbing it is astronomical, immeasurable. One lives constantly under the conscious, tangible, uninterrupted protection of a God who takes his position and fights. The other lives in fragile hope, in the uncertainty of whether God will perhaps protect, perhaps intervene. One has a nervous system calibrated for peace, security, and unshakable confidence. The other lives in a state of constant alertness, latent anxiety, residual fear. The truth about Pesach is not merely historical. It is not merely a distant theological concept. It is neurological. It is present. It is yours. 3,500 years after that night of terror and redemption in Egypt, on a rocky, desolate hill outside the walls of Jerusalem, a dark and infamous hill called Golgotha, the true and eternal Lamb stretched out his arms, not to cry out, but as protective wings, vast and divine, over all of sinful humanity. The blood that flowed, warm and life-giving, was no longer on the wooden doorframes. It was on the rough and brutal wood of the cross. And in that moment of darkness and supreme sacrifice, Pesach, P.S.Chi, found its absolute, definitive, and eternal fulfillment. Jesus did not merely die at Passover by some historical or chronological coincidence. He is the definitive Pesach, the eternal, immutable protection with outstretched wings, the unshakable shield for all generations. When the Roman centurion, in a gesture of cruelty and curiosity, drove his spear into his side and blood and water poured forth, it was not merely an insignificant medical detail, an anatomical record. It was the supreme sign, the cosmic seal that divine protection, in its fullest and most sacrificial form, was being offered to all who, in their souls, believe in him. What once protected a single household in Egypt now, at the cross, sheltered hearts in every nation, every people, every era, forever. Picture the scene loaded with chaos and tragedy, brutal Roman soldiers, religious authorities blinded by their own power, howling crowds hungry for blood, total pandemonium of darkness and despair. But in the supernatural darkness that covered the earth that day, an extraordinary and invisible phenomenon was unfolding. The wings of the Almighty, the wings of the Messiah himself, were stretching out, protective and redemptive, over repentant sinners, over broken hearts. The thief on the cross, in his last agonizing moments, experienced Pesach in its fullness. He was not merely passed over from the justice he deserved. He was covered, enveloped, protected by divine mercy. "Today you will be with me in paradise," was the unmistakable confirmation that the Messiah's protective wings had already reached him, had already covered him, had already saved him. And here is the climax, the revelation that completely transforms the very essence of your faith. When you understand in your heart and mind that Jesus is your personal Pesach, that his wings are perpetually outstretched over you, not for a moment but for all eternity, that his blood did not merely pay your sin debt, but established a permanent, unshakable, inviolable protection over your life, you will never be the same. Every storm that approaches, every threat that appears on the horizon, finds you already covered, already sheltered beneath that divine shield. Every accusation of the enemy, every arrow of the evil one, strikes and shatters against the outstretched wings of the Lamb. Every fear that tries to settle in your soul dissolves, disintegrates in the presence of the one who does not pass over your problems ignoring them, but covers them, enfolds them, nullifies them with his divine protection, his omnipotent presence. The blood of Jesus did not make God pass over your sins, acting as if they did not exist, turning a blind eye to injustice. No, he covered them definitively. He removed them. He annulled them with his life. The difference between those two understandings is eternal, immeasurable. To pass over suggests something is still there, merely ignored, temporarily suspended, a time bomb waiting to go off. But covering means complete protection, total redemption, radical transformation, absolute security, an indestructible seal. You're not waiting for God to ignore your failures, to shut his eyes to your mistakes. No, you are living in this very moment under the permanent protection of the Lamb who became your wings, your fortress, your sanctuary. This is the truth that translators, in their limitation, may never have told you fully, that theology, in its simplification, may have lost, that your heart, in its depth, always knew existed. Jesus Christ is your eternal Pesach, not an annual event to merely remember, a ritual to be repeated. It is a living, dynamic, present reality to inhabit every single moment. His wings are over you, right now, in this exact moment. As this truth penetrates your soul, the protection that began on that night in Egypt under the shadow of death culminated in the sacrifice at Calvary and is active, powerful and present over your life, today and forever. Breathe deeply. Feel the truth penetrate every cell of your being and receive with an open heart the most profound of declarations. Lord Jesus, you are my eternal Pesach. Your wings are over me. I live protected by your blood, covered by your mercy, safe beneath your wings, forever.